All right, today on The Explainer, we're tackling a really big one, Hamas. It's a name you hear all the time, but the story of how they came to be is, well, it's complicated and often misunderstood. We're going to unpack that transformation. So here's the big question we're trying to answer. How on earth did a religious charity end up as the governing power in Gaza? I mean, think about it. It's not just a story about fighting. It's about social movements. It's about political power grabs. It's a huge shift. How does a group go from handing out aid to running a territory? That's the puzzle we're going to solve. Okay, so to really get a handle on Hamas, you can't just start with Hamas. Nope, you have to go way back to its predecessor, the Muslim Brotherhood. The groundwork for everything that came later was laid decades before Hamas even existed. You know, the Muslim Brotherhood was really playing the long game. They got started in Egypt, set up shop in Palestine back in the 40s, but the real turning point, that was 1967. When Israel occupied Gaza, a huge power vacuum opened up. And a young leader, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, he saw a chance. He realized that while everyone else was focused on fighting, they could focus on building a base from the ground up.
So at this point, you've basically got two main paths for Palestinians. On one side, you have the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. They're all about secular nationalism and armed struggle. But then you have the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza, and they're playing a totally different sport. Their whole strategy was re-Islamizing society from the bottom up, through social work, schools, clinics. And here's a crucial point. For a while, Israel kind of let them do it. Why? Well, they saw the Brotherhood as a good way to counterbalance the PLO, which they viewed as the much bigger threat at the time.
And you want to know if that grassroots strategy worked? Oh, yeah. Just look at the numbers. Between 1967 and 1986, the number of mosques in Gaza literally tripled. We're talking from 200 to 600. And you have to understand, these weren't just places for prayer. They were the center of everything, community centers, schools, and, eventually, perfect places for recruitment. But that slow and steady approach, it was about to hit a wall. Hard. By the late 1980s, all the anger that had been simmering for decades under occupation just exploded. Suddenly, the Muslim Brotherhood strategy of patience ran out of road. Everything was about to change. That explosion was the First Intifada, which kicked off in December 1987. And this wasn't some top-down, organized campaign. No, this was a spontaneous uprising from the streets. And the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, they looked around and realized, okay, our social work-only approach isn't going to cut it anymore. The pressure was on, and they knew they had to get in the game. So what did they do? Sheikh Yassin and the other leaders made a pivotal choice. They created a brand new organization, one specifically for this uprising, and that organization was Hamas. They made it crystal clear in their 1988 charter, this wasn't a split from the Muslim Brotherhood, it was a wing of it. It was their new armed resistance movement. And from there, things just spun up into this vicious cycle, and fast. Hamas would carry out its first attacks on soldiers. Israel would respond by declaring Hamas a terrorist organization and arresting its leaders. That would lead Hamas's military wing, the Qassam Brigades, to ramp up their attacks, which then led to Israel deporting hundreds of Hamas members. You can see how this was just escalating step by step. Then came the 1990s and the Oslo Peace Process. This was a massive political development, but Hamas wanted nothing to do with it. They were completely opposed. And it was their violent opposition to Oslo that pushed them down a totally new path, a path that would eventually lead them from bombs to, believe it or not, the ballot box. Now, during this time, Hamas started using its most infamous and controversial tactic. And it's really important we get the terminology right because it shows the deep divide in how this is seen. What Israel, the U.S., and the West call suicide bombing, an act of terrorism, Hamas and its supporters call martyrdom operations. They frame it as a justified, even religious act of resistance against a much more powerful military. And Hamas leaders were very direct about their justification. People like Abdel Aziz al-Rantisi basically said, this is a response to Israel's own actions. They specifically pointed to things like the 1994 Hebron massacre, where an Israeli settler walked into a mosque and killed 29 Palestinians while they were praying. For Hamas, that was the line in the sand. That's when they said, okay, if our civilians are being killed, we will target theirs. So after all those years of violent resistance, Hamas made this huge strategic pivot. They decided to run in the 2006 Palestinian elections. Their platform was change and reform, and what happened next was nothing short of a political earthquake. They didn't just win a few seats, they won a clear majority. It stunned everybody, the international community, their rivals in Fatah, and frankly, I think it even surprised Hamas itself.
But as they say, winning the election is the easy part. Actually governing, that's a whole different beast. Hamas was about to find out that being in charge brought a whole new world of problems they'd never faced before.
What followed that election victory was just total chaos. The international community immediately slapped sanctions on the new Hamas-led government. They tried to form a unity government with Fatah, but that fell apart spectacularly over arguments about security and power. And it all came to a head in June 2007, when a brief but bloody civil war erupted, leaving Hamas in complete, violent control of the Gaza Strip.
And the response to that takeover? Israel and Egypt slammed the door shut, imposing a full-on blockade. All the official border crossings were closed. The economy in Gaza just cratered. Unemployment went through the roof. For the average person, life became this desperate daily struggle. It's why you started hearing Gaza described as a large-scale prison.
So how did Hamas possibly hang on to power under all that pressure? Well, they were pretty resourceful. They built up their own security forces, created their own media channels like al-Aqsa TV to shape the story, but their real lifeline? It was literally underground. They built this huge tunnel economy under the border with Egypt, and by taxing everything that came through those tunnels, food, fuel, weapons, you name it, they created a revenue stream to keep their government afloat.
Of course, this whole period was also marked by several incredibly destructive wars with Israel. And when you look at the human cost, just between 2007 and 2014, the numbers are just stark. You can see the huge disparity, which really highlights the lopsided nature of the conflict and the devastating price paid by the people living in Gaza.
So that brings us to today. After all this transformation, from charity to armed group to government, what is Hamas really? And this gets us to the core tension that defines them. This constant battle between their hardcore ideology and the messy, complicated reality of trying to rule and survive. Even the experts can't agree on how to define Hamas. You've got two main schools of thought. One camp says they're essentially a global jihadist group, ideologically driven, connected to groups like al-Qaeda, and their ultimate goal is just the destruction of Israel, period. But another camp sees them very differently. They argue Hamas is actually a pragmatic nationalist movement, that their violence isn't about global jihad, but is a direct, localized reaction to the Israeli occupation. And this quote from the founder, Sheikh Yassin, it really gets to the heart of the group's ideological strength. He says, assassination isn't failure, it's martyrdom, like a wedding celebration. By framing loss this way, not as a defeat, but as a sacred act, Hamas could absorb devastating blows, like having its leaders killed, and still keep going. It made them incredibly resilient, which leaves us with one final huge question. Is Hamas, at its core, a movement of faith? Is it a fight for land and a nation? Or is it simply a product of occupation? The real answer, of course, is probably a messy, complicated mix of all three. And wrestling with that complexity is the only way to understand its past and what might come next.